The Pest and Predator podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Welcome to the Pest and Predator podcast. I'm your host, Sean Haney, founder of realagriculture.com. Season 4 of the Pest and Predators podcast. It is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Today on the Pest and Predator podcast, we're going to take a look back at some of the things that happened in 2022 and then look ahead to the 2023 growing season and what we can expect on the prairies when it comes to insect populations. To do that, we have an entomologist from each of the prairie provinces. We're going to hear from Dr. Shelley Barkley with Alberta Agriculture, Dr. James Tansey from Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture, and Dr. John Gavloski with Manitoba Agriculture. Let's listen to what they have to say. Okay, today on the Pest and Predator podcast, let's dive into what happened in 2022 and really take that look ahead to the 2023 growing season. Let's bring in our panelists and get to the discussion. Up first, Jim, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, thanks. How's it going?
John, great to see you again.
Nice seeing you again, Sean.
And Shelley, it's great to have you on the Pest and Predator podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Sean. Thank you.
Okay, Shelley, let's start with you. Let's take a look back at 2022 because that's always provides a bit of a perspective as we look at the year ahead. So from a 2022 perspective, what did it look like for pests and predators?
Any insect that was favored by dry, warm weather, hot weather, has been really successful. So grasshoppers, wheat stem sawfly, were probably some of the biggest things that we faced in 2022.
Let's hope in 2023 we break some of this, at least the dry component. We'll take hot, but some of the dry component would be nice to break. Jim, in Saskatchewan, what were some of the highlights or maybe lowlights, I should put it, in terms of pests and predators?
Yeah, again, grasshoppers, as Shelley mentioned, animals that are favored by hot, dry conditions. Of course, we had some timely rains in May as well, and that led to an upregulation in our wheat midge populations in some parts of the province, despite a forecast for relatively low numbers in those areas. But yeah, of course, everything is tied to the precipitation with those ones. Lots of grasshoppers, especially in central and southern regions. Flea beetle pressure was very high, particularly in the northeast and eastern regions, and we saw an upregulation in pea leaf weevil populations in the northeast as well. On a plus side, we saw a retraction of cabbage seed pod weevil populations. I suspect that's probably due to the dry conditions in 2021 and poor host plant quality, but again, that's speculation.
And John, Manitoba saw a really kind of unique growing season, and the fact that it was a bit of a late start, but things all worked out for the pretty good for farmers. What happened in 2022 when it comes to pests?
So you mentioned the late start, and that really did have a factor on some of our pest issues. The big two that we had were flea beetles and grasshoppers. Those were by far the dominant insect pest issues. We had a lot of late earth seeding. Now, for some people that might have worked to their advantage, but we had situations where the canola was just sitting in the seedling stages for way too long in late May and early June in some fields. So we had a lot of foliar spraying going on and some reseeding because of flea beetles. The grasshoppers, we had a lot of later maturing crops, and so there was some significant grasshopper damage in areas. Now, the one thing that was maybe a little bit different than we saw in some of the other prairie provinces, we had some aphids arrive that caused some damage in some of our crops. And this partially may be due to the later seeding that we had. So in soybeans, we had soybean aphid come in. Most of the spraying was happening in August. The soybeans were still in their vulnerable stages quite long. And same with the cereals. We had both bird cherry oat aphid and English grain aphid come in. Now, in most years by August, the crop is way too far advanced for the aphids to be an issue, but we had some significant spraying for cereal aphids this year as well, and also in peas. We had spraying for pea aphids.
Every
You know,
year,
we saw,
sorry, go ahead, Jim.
no, I was just going to say we saw similar aphid issues in Saskatchewan as well.
Okay, let's take a look ahead here to 2023. Jim, let's start with you. What are you expecting when it comes to the population loads and some of the issues that farmers are going to have to be aware of when it comes to pests and predators for 2023?
Well, I think the one that's front of mind for everyone is grasshoppers right now. You know, given the heavy populations that we saw in central and southern regions. I mean, John did mention the the cool, wet spring and some of the delays, and that seems to have suppressed some of the grasshopper populations in eastern portions of, particularly northeastern portions of of Saskatchewan's growing regions. But we had really terrific conditions for egg laying for grasshoppers in July and August, and really that's when it matters. So dry to very dry conditions in central and southern regions. That and the correlation of that with really heavy populations. So a lot of opportunity for boy to meet girl and for those eggs to go into the ground. So
does a cool, we're kind of looking here a bit of a late spring because Mother Nature just wants February to continue into April, it seems. Does that cool spring help us when it comes to grasshopper loads for the season?
It can delay their development. They overwinter as eggs. So we, in Saskatchewan at any rate, we've got 4 primary pests, and they all overwinter. Grasshopper pests, pardon me, and they all overwinter as eggs in a state that's called diapause. So it's a state of arrested development, and their development is dictated by temperature, but they can hunker down. They are native to the prairies and pretty cold resilient, so they can hunker down and wait for those warm temperatures. The updated forecast for long term is looking at some warmer temperatures. So I mean, they can speed through their development relatively quickly.
Resilient buggers. Okay, Shelley, what are you expecting? I know a lot of farmers in southern Alberta are very concerned about grasshoppers, but there's also those pesky gophers as well.
Well, gophers are out of my purview. I would expect we're going to see grasshoppers, just like Jim said, in southern Alberta, up the Saskatchewan-Alberta border. And in the piece, because it's a year ending in an odd number, I would expect that there may be some issues with Brunner's grasshopper in the piece. Grasshopper seems to follow a 2-year life cycle. So yeah, an odd year in the Alberta piece means there could be some Brunner's there. For sure.
Okay. And John, what is Manitoba looking at?
Well, the two that are a bit more predictable are the flea beetles and the grasshoppers. We've had chronic high flea beetle populations for several years, and I just don't see that declining anytime soon. So I think it's advisable for farmers and agronomists just to anticipate high flea beetle populations and do whatever they can to try to get quick germination and quick early growth from the crop. Grasshoppers, as was mentioned, we also had good egg laying conditions. We do a survey late in the season, and we look at adult grasshoppers and what their numbers are like during that egg laying period. And we had some, I'll say, moderate and maybe some areas high numbers last year. But as Jim mentioned, the conditions were very good for egg laying. So grasshoppers are certainly one that people have to have on their radar going into next year. The others are really hard to call because the aphids I mentioned, soybean aphid, as far as we know, doesn't overwinter in the Canadian prairies. And same with the English grain aphid and the oat bird cherry aphid. They're aphids that blow in. So you can have very different years back to back. Pea aphid does overwinter somewhat, but when we do get big problems with them, it's often that's augmented by populations that have blown in. So the aphids are a little bit harder to predict. And I'll just mention one more that we dealt with a little bit last year, lygus bugs. After several years where they really didn't make much of an appearance, we did have some spraying for lygus bugs last year, and they can successfully overwinter in the Canadian prairies as well. So they're another one just to keep on our radar for next year.
And are flea beetle populations just kind of like a given? Is that just we expect it at this point?
It's been that way for a while, actually. What was tricky with flea beetles was some of the insects that we've covered, and we're probably getting into this. We've got some good natural enemies that once the pest gets high, the natural enemies will build their populations, take the pests down. You get these cycles. We just haven't been seeing that type of cycling with flea beetles. There isn't really a parasitoid or a few key predators that seem to be able to take their populations down, and they can overwinter well in the Canadian prairies. So yeah, they've been almost flatlined at high level for quite a while.
Jim and Shelley, do you have any comments about flea beetles?
Ditto.
Yeah.
No, I just, to John's point, I mean, yeah, we can count on relatively consistent pressure, and that's across the board. But I mean, we can get some variability. I mean, we've seen heavy flea beetle populations across canola growing regions in Saskatchewan. What was interesting from last year, though, was as many might be familiar with, we're seeing a bit of a shift or a replacement of crucifer flea beetle with striped flea beetle in a lot of canola growing regions, and that extends right down into the Dakotas. So, regions that typically didn't have any striped flea beetle there seemed to be stripe moving in, and the converse was actually apparent last year in the Saskatoon area, and the suspicion is that's associated with some of the hot, dry conditions. So striped flea beetle doesn't do as well in hot, dry conditions as crucifer flea beetle. And in the Saskatoon area, of course, it was very hot and dry in 2021, and that may have had a regulating effect on the striped flea beetles. With the snowpack that we have this year, I'm curious to see what happens with the striped flea beetle population, and the moisture associated with that, and the cool weather in the spring. Stay tuned to this channel. We'll an update.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong here. What I'm hearing is that even though it's been cold the end of March, bizarrely cold early April, if you're farming and thinking that this sort of insect issues for 2023 are over, it's gonna this cold weather is gonna kill them off and we're gonna be fine. That is a false narrative. Absolutely,
yeah, they are tough as nails, and part of the reason that they are as tough as they are, animals that live in this environment, is they use something called supercooling temperatures, or that is, they have proteins and or alcohols that they produce in their bodies that reduce the freezing temperature of their blood, their hemolymph. And when you're talking about grasshoppers, I mean, that can be very cold, minus 18. We've got some invasives that are less tough, and pea leaf weevil and cabbage seed pod weevil are considerably less cold hardy than some of the native species. But as a rule, yeah, they can really depress their freezing temperatures, and so it's not the cold that kills, it's crystal formation that kills. And if they can stop that ice from forming in their bodies and tissue disruption, then Bob's your uncle. They're ready to go for the next season. So.
Great. Okay.
The other thing to keep in mind there, Sean, is that we've got these super cold tolerant insects, but also beneath that snow, it's not all that cold.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So, even if it's still minus 20, say, above the snow, you have a couple inches of snow on the ground. It's probably barely below freezing where they are. And as Jim mentioned, they can survive some pretty cold temperatures. So you almost need next to no snow and wickedly cold temperatures to kill some of these pests. In the case of grasshopper eggs, you don't want conditions that will kill grasshopper eggs, because you won't have any winter wheat surviving, or alfalfa and things like that. So
yeah, quite true. Oh, okay. In terms of, we're going to get into some of the beneficials here in a second. Just I want to, what farmers need to do, same rules apply to all other years. Make sure as we're going through the growing season, we're out there and we're scouting and we're sweeping and we're paying attention from a control perspective. Right, Shelley?
Absolutely. Nothing replaces boots in the field, like Norm Fleury says. Yeah. You got to be walking those fields, or walking the ditches even. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about some of the friendly predators that farmers need to be on the lookout for as they go to manage their pests in 2023. Of course, Pest and Predator podcast, we've learned a lot about some of these beneficials that are working for you for free, the field heroes, as we call them. Shelley, let's start with you.
Well, one of my favorites is Macroglens, who does a pretty good job of looking after wheat midge. And in Alberta, we could be set up for some wheat midge in that area from sort of Edmonton east into Saskatchewan. So we're going to be counting on scouting, but also some of those Macroglens coming along and helping us look after the population.
John, how about you?
So I'm going to pick one that we saw a lot of last year that was often misidentified, hoverfly larvae. They look like slugs. And we saw a lot of this in our cereal crops and our pea crops, a little bit in the soybeans too. Growers and agronomists phoning in, what are these slugs all over slug-like things all over my crop? Well, they're hoverfly larvae, and they're there because you had lots of aphids. And they can be confusing because sometimes they're green, sometimes they're a brownish color, and other times they're almost a pinkish color, very much slug-like. They've got a tapered end, which is their head end, and they've just got a hook for a mouth part. They'll impale an aphid, hold it up, suck the juice out, plop it back down, grab another one. They're actually blind and legless, but the adults of hoverflies, which are very good bee and wasp mimics, a lot of people think they're a bee or a wasp, they're attracted to the honeydew that aphids produce. So they know where the aphids are, and they lay their eggs right in the aphid colonies. So when they hatch out, they're blind, legless, slug-like larvae. They're right in the aphid colonies, and they just start picking off the aphids and devouring them.
So much happening in that canopy. Okay, Jim, what are you on the lookout for this year?
One that we saw last year, localized but pretty spectacular when it did occur, was Entomophora grillii, which is a fungal pathogen of grasshoppers, and there are different isolates of it. So some will, attack one species of grasshopper but not influence another. So you could have clear-wing grasshopper right next to two-stripe grasshopper, which can occur on a fairly regular basis, and all the two-stripe are dying off without influencing the clear-wing or vice versa. So you see both cases happening. So specific isolates of this fungus are going after specific species of grasshopper. What the grasshopper does is oblige its host, or what the fungus, does is oblige its host, the grasshopper, to climb to the top of a plant and grab on for dear life. And of course, their exoskeleton's a lot like a suit of armor, and so that'll kind of lock into place. And so when they die, they're stuck on the top of the plant, and then that dead insect is a source of fungal spores. So all those fungal spores are going to rain down on all the grasshoppers' palates and infect them. So we saw some pretty significant populations of those of Entomophora outbreaks in grasshoppers. So I mean, quarter sections of crop, littered with dead grasshoppers on the top that apparently could be smelled from a mile or two away. I mean, they're big meaty animals, so they do stink when they die. So especially in numbers. So conditions that are conducive to thunderstorms, fungi like it humid. There's something that contributes to outbreaks of Entomophora and influences or inflicts regulation on grasshopper populations.
John, I know you have another one you wanted to bring up too that is really super cool.
So yeah, they're called aphid mummies, and you'll be able to identify them as a, quote, mummy, because they look like an aphid that's somewhat inflated, and the color isn't right. They're almost a bronzy or brown color. Sometimes they can be black, depending on the type of wasp that laid an egg into them. So what those aphid mummies are, they have been a home for a wasp larva. And what happens in this case, you have a tiny little black wasp that is going around laying eggs right into the aphids. And when those wasp eggs hatch, the larva of the wasp eventually it kills the aphid, and the aphid becomes a home for the wasp larva. It kind of inflates a little bit, becomes a nice home for this wasp larva. The wasp larva lives inside of the aphid. eats its guts out, and eventually will exit the aphid mummy. And sometimes you'll even see a little hole in the aphid mummy where the wasp emerge from the aphid mummy. Some years they can take out quite a bit of the aphid population. We saw them a lot in the peas last year. That's where it really stood out. Some of the pea fields, people were noticing a lot. And I was getting the question from agronomists, we're starting to see a lot of this, but the aphids are above the economic threshold. What do we do? And it actually puts growers into a real conundrum, because they can see this biological control happening, but they're still above threshold. Fortunately, we now have some selective insecticides that might help out in situations like that. But yeah, it really was quite noticeable in some fields last year.
Fantastic stuff. Looking forward to the 2023 growing season, and I'm sure that whatever challenges in front of us when it comes to pests, the research community and the grower is ready to tackle it with all the information. Great stuff here again in another episode of the Pest and Predator podcast. Thanks so much to all three of you for joining us.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pest and Predator podcast. It's brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm.